Yama. Hello, and welcome to the iconic Shrine Dome, the home of science in Australia. My name is Jagadish. I'm currently serving as the president of the Australian Academy of Science, and I warmly welcome you all to the iconic Shrine Dome. I would first like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting this evening, the Ngunnawal people. It is upon their ancestral lands that the Australian Academy of Science is built. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. I would like to welcome to the Shrine Dome the Chief Justice of the ACT, the Honourable Lucy McCallum, Dr. Kathy Foley, Australia's Chief Scientist, President of the Australian Academy of Law, the Honourable Ellen Robertson, our international guests, Professor Mette Nygaard and Professor Michael Toft-Overgaard, who have travelled a long way to be with us this evening. Thank you for joining us. Executive members and fellows of both the Academies of Law and Science. And a warm welcome to you all. We are delighted to be here this evening in collaboration with the Australian Academy of Law. In this, our 7th annual symposium, we value the opportunity to explore matters at the intersection of science and the law. Over the years, we have held joint symposia on topics such as the reception, quality, and evaluation of scientific evidence in Australian courts, future directions of technology and law in relation to artificial intelligence, the science-law interface as it relates to climate change, and the science and law of prohibited drugs. The need for a stronger and influential dialogue between the science and law sectors is certainly not diminishing. Far from it. Advances in science and technology are rapidly shifting the boundaries of knowledge, and justice systems worldwide continue in their quest to deliver justice fairly and equitably. These conditions demand a deeper interdisciplinary collaboration between our sectors and the creation of a more science-sensitive legal system. The Australian Academy of Science's role as an independent scientific advisor to the second inquiry into the convictions of Kathleen Foley provides a unique and exemplary demonstration of how the science and justice systems can work together in practical ways to enable evidence-informed decision-making in the justice system. This evening, we'll hear about a range of cases that go to the heart of how evidence has been and is currently heard in the justice system. We have an excellent expert panel to share their knowledge with us, and I know there is much knowledge in the audience too, so I look forward to hearing your questions. To introduce our panel, please join me in warmly welcoming a friend of both of our academies, our chair for this evening, ACT Chief Justice, and I have the habit of calling Chief Scientist, but now I have to change that one for this evening.
Very happy to be a chief
and I call it as ACT Chief Justice, the Honourable Lucy McCallum. Please join me in warmly welcoming.
Thank you so much. I also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians. I should say in that context that historically we have acknowledged the Ngunnawal. We know from recent contest in the ACT that we should also acknowledge the Ngambri, who claim to be traditional custodians as well. And that in itself raises an interesting scientific question about how people, mob in the ACT, know whether they're traditional custodians. It raises questions of connection with country and the historical records, largely oral through songlines and stories told from generation to generation, but also in a large body of correspondence that a particular researcher in the ACT found. So those are the kinds of questions where law and science intersect, and it's a great honour to be asked to chair this evening's event. I think the connection of the two academies, the Australian Academy of Law and the Australian Academy of Science, is extremely valuable. I've been reflecting this evening, in preparation for this evening, on how it is that lawyers and scientists think differently. Obviously, we had some discussions beforehand about what we were going to talk about, but for me, it comes down to the very different purposes for which we undertake our respective disciplines. The lawyer, if you like, is preparing for a singularity, a single event, a day in court when the witness will or will not come up to proof and when a fact will or will not be established according to the standard of proof that applies on that day. The scientist, by contrast, is, if you like, on an infinite line of learning, of lifelong learning, almost hoping, as Neil deGrasse Tyson put it in a podcast I listened to recently, almost hoping that a hypothesis will be disproved, because that is the purpose of science, is to hold a hypothesis up and wait for someone to prove or disprove it, and not always looking for that singular or definitive truth that lawyers think they find, but which is really quite elusive. We are very privileged this evening to be joined by an extraordinary array of speakers with an incredible amount of knowledge and experience. You don't need to hear any more from me, because contrary to my wishes and Jagdish's kind suggestion, I'm not the chief scientist of the ACT, although I think that would be rather a treat. But our first speaker is Professor Ian Chubb, who is the former Chief Scientist of Australia. Professor Chubb is the Secretary Science Policy at the Australian Academy of Science and is a strong and effective advocate for science, particularly through his former role as Chief Scientist of Australia and as Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. And he is going to speak, among other things, about my favourite intersection of the law and science, which is that lawyers think they know everything but actually know nothing.
Thank you, Lucy. Only you could say that. I couldn't, possibly, even if I agree with it. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you. Sorry about my voice. Atmosphere, dry, change of season, and an old, overly used larynx. I want to support Jagdish's acknowledgement of our Indigenous peoples and their cultures and their learnings. Like a lot of young Australians, I had heroes, usually cricketers and footballers, but now, in my later years, my hero is Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was an astrophysicist who would have applied the word singularity to quite a different concept, but yours was legitimate, so was his. But Carl was one of the most prolific exponents of science to the general community that you could possibly want to meet. I think you could all read his books. There's one in particular that I appreciate, which is called Science as a Candle in the Dark. And he explains how science will take us further than we presently are in our knowledge, our understanding, and indeed in our civilisation. But I couldn't do his words justice. So I've got 3 quotes for you tonight at different points. The first one is this one. It's accurate, and its accuracy is becoming increasingly exposed as we try to grapple with particular system-wide issues that require a lot of thinking from different sides to get to some sort of understanding of what it is, where it is, how it is, and what do we do about it if we want to change it, build on it, or adapt to it, or indeed mitigate it if we think about things like climate. So I think Carl got it right. I don't think it's you have to do a lot of research to find out why I would say that. But I would also say to you that arguably modern society is more dependent on science and scientific discovery than at any other period of human existence. And yet arguably less is known about the practices and the norms of science. So how does it work? Lucy just talked about disproving hypotheses. Yes, of course, that's what we do. I don't know too many scientists who would argue that everything there is to know about a particular topic is actually known. They might posit that it is, and then they'll try and test it by finding out something that's not known. So it is quite an approach that is easy to misrepresent when you have a community, or indeed a profession, that looks for closer to certainty. So is it absolutely 100% certain that human-induced climate change exists, that it's our contribution to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are leading to the planetary warming that we're seeing and the destructive impact of extreme weather events and so on? I don't know anybody who would tell you that it's absolutely 100% certain, but I know a lot of people who would tell you that the evidence is overwhelming, and overwhelming in favour of that suggestion. So as scientists, we know science is simply what is known until now, till right now. So my second quote from Carl Sagan is curiosity and the urge to solve problems are the emotional hallmarks of our species. So it's not actually, our species in this article is not scientists, it's all of us. So we're all curious. One of the other Carl Sagan quotes that I haven't got, but I'll give you, is kids are born curious, but our education system beats it out of them. And that's true too. So we are instinctively curious as a species, all of us, whatever it is that we choose to do, whatever profession it is we choose to pursue. And then we handle that in different ways according to the processes and norms of our profession. But we do more as a consequence, because we're curious, we do more to learn more. But as we do more, do we in fact learn more? In fact, learn more. And how do we use what we learn? At the end of the day, we want to know more for betterment, however you define that. Wherever it is that you're looking for it, that's what we do it for, one would argue. So what I want to remind you of tonight is the pace of scientific discovery, the pace of change, and the sheer scale of the contemporary scientific enterprise, and the challenges that it poses, not just for scientists, but for all fields of human endeavour that depend, at least in part, on science, including, dare I say, the legal system. So later this evening, you're going to discuss the Kathleen Folbig case. I'm not going to talk about it at length, but let me remind you that Folbig was incarcerated for 20 years for the murder of 3 of her children and manslaughter of her 4th. Following a second inquiry into her convictions in 2023, she was pardoned and later had her convictions quashed, largely because of developments in science. Folbig was convicted in 2003. That was the same year the Human Genome Project was completed. That project cost the funders $2.7 billion. It was not a study of an individual's genome. It was a pool of 20 genomes from many more volunteers, so it could be easily anonymised. It took 13 years after 6 years of planning. But what it was a landmark. It was a new start. So the Human Genome Project and the international collaboration and cooperation that led to our sequencing and mapping the entire human genome. Its success led to the foundation for modern genomics. Indeed, it could be said, easily argued, that it created a field of science that has transformed medicine and personalised healthcare, uncovering genetic bases for numerous diseases, enabling improved diagnostics and targeted therapies. It's enabled the development of genetically modified crops with improved yield, resistance to pests and tolerance to environmental stresses, as well as led to comparative genomics in livestock breeding. The planet population is growing, climate's changing, the weather's changing, we've got to feed them all. And the genomics will help us do that. It's helped us understand our past by shedding light on human evolution, migration patterns and genetic diversity, by comparing the genome across populations and species, and nowadays across millennia. There was an article published last week of the genome studies on individuals in Pompeii. So they were frazzled, burnt alive. What was interesting about it was that the discoverers had seen certain physical proximities that they thought showed relationships. So a male and a female holding a young child, so on. What the genome study showed that none of those were true, that they were actually people just apparently comforting each other. But we can actually take it back to tens of thousands of years now. And you can work on the genome from a single tooth in caves in China that are 20, 100,000 years old. So the skills, the talent, the facilities have improved enormously and lead to enormous change in our understandings. The Genome Project led to accelerated discovery in emerging scientific fields like bioinformatics, computational biology, pharmacogenomics, epigenomics, synthetic biology, where we actually begin to treat an individual. So the old style was that if you had an ache, you took an aspirin tablet 3 times a day, only for a couple of weeks, or you might bleed out, but it was just treating to the average. And we still do that, and of course we do. But in addition to that, we can also look at an individual's genome, we can repurpose medicines, we can treat quite differently, we can encourage, we can build, we can support quite differently according to what the individual is representing and not the average of the population. Can't underestimate the significance of that in an ageing population, a changing demographic like we have in the world, but also in Australia. So genomics has provided us with the tools to transform forensic science through high-resolution analysis of DNA evidence. It's transformed disaster victim identification, aka Pompeii, but not only. Helped resolve cold cases, track illegal wildlife trade, and promises to aid in the accuracy of individual identification. As you'll hear later, can also help to resolve not just cold cases, but aid in the identification of wrongful convictions. One of the issues that's happened is the cost of doing this work. So this is the cost of studying a genome. So it started off at, I forget the number, 100 million. Now it's down to under $100, not 100 million. And there are companies which offer it overnight. So you got a problem, take a swab, stick it off. Probably people in this room, well, more than just me, have sent a swab off to get your own genome looked at by one of the companies that now offer it for something like $200, and they're making a profit. So it has changed the dynamic within which we work. In healthcare, in food and agriculture, in law, because you can do this, and you can do that on samples that date back hundreds of thousands of years, if they've been in a cave. So it changes the way we think about it, and it changes the way what we can do about it. One of the interesting consequences probably, although I'm not going to argue cause and effect, but correlation, is if you look at the next one, what you see here is the number of papers published in genomics over the course of, from 2003, Folbig's trial, through to 2023. It's gone up from somewhere around 10,000 to 43,000 in a year. That's not aggregate number, that's each year. And so there's a massive amount of information that is now available and available for use. What we have to do is decide ethically and with integrity how it's used. And that debate continues. I did have a slide that showed you the number of scientific publications that have gone up over a shorter period, but it was too frightening. But what I can tell you is that in 2022, there were 2.8 million publications put into the public domain in 1 year. 2013, so 9 years earlier, it was 1.7 million. So we've gone up 1.1 million in a total of 9 years. So how we get on top of it, how we distinguish between the dodgy, the uncertain, whatever we want to describe it as, whatever euphemism we use, to the stuff that is really valuable that we can use is one of the issues that certainly does confront us, and that comes back to expertise and how you get a fair reading of a complicated system using real experts and not partisan experts. One of the biggest challenges in science policy today is the translation deficit. How do we ensure that the rapid rate of discovery of knowledge is translated to benefit society? That does exercise the Academy of Science. We do worry about the fact you can swamp with information and you've got to be able to distinguish the real, the useful from the other stuff. So how do we weigh scientific evidence? What weight do we give it? Find the right expert or understanding without falling for the all too common trap of cherry picking the evidence that suits our particular cognitive biases. Dave Wallace, a young lawyer with a background in immunogenomics, suggested genetic sequencing could help resolve the cause for the Folbig children's deaths. He reached out to Carola Vinuesa, a scientist from ANU, fellow of the Academy, whose involvement significantly influenced the case. Someone with Dave Wallace's experience is rare. Not many students choose to study both science and law. So as there are a small proportion of lawyers who have the capability that he has. Now, ABS data might not meet exacting scientific standards because of how the qualifications are reported, but they do give us a hint. Of over 93,000 legal professionals, only 1,086 indicate having a natural and physical sciences degree as their highest qualification. So 1,000 out of 93,000. I'm proud to say that I contribute to that. 2 of my daughters did science and law, taught by an eminent person sitting in the audience looking at me, wondering whether I was going to mention him tonight. But yes, I do. But they work as lawyers, but wish they were scientists. You might explain to them why that's so. So, given that rapid rate of change, how can we hope to keep up? How can we recognise or understand the extraordinary amount of possible evidence, potential evidence, real evidence that has now been generated by the scientists of the world, including in this country? The Folbig case for me is a powerful reminder of the transformative potential of science when integrated effectively into the justice system. And I guess there are key words in that sentence: integrated effectively, and particularly effectively, transformative and potential. But it also highlights the urgent need for more individuals who can bridge these two worlds. Today's discussions will explore how we can nurture this vital intersection of science and the law, ensuring that justice is able to keep pace with scientific discovery. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It is interesting to reflect when you think about the cost of that research, and frequently as judges what we face is a legal aid lawyer saying they don't even have the funding to get a psychiatric report for someone who might not be fit to plead. So I think it's very valuable to explore those intersections between the way lawyers are often practicing and the work that scientists are doing. It's also very troubling to think of the quantity of papers that are being published and the impossibility of lawyers keeping across that. And it's one thing to have the likes of the speakers that we'll hear from later who have this incredible research that can crack open a long-running case. But for the day-to-day work of barristers who are trying to defend someone against scientific evidence, I remember when I was a very young prosecutor over 35 years ago, a barrister faced with fingerprint evidence and one of the earliest cases of DNA evidence in Australia. Fingerprint evidence, he started off by asking the expert, now, you'll remember fingerprint evidence used to have 12 points of identification. He started with the first point and said, now, is that's a peak, yes? And the expert said, no, that's a trough, Mr. Brewster. And then went to his second point and said, now that one, that's a trough, isn't it? And he go, no, Mr. Brewster, that's a peak. And the magistrate, who was weary by that time, leaned forward and said, I take it you have at least 10 further points of cross-examination, Mr. Brewster. But grappling with the introduction of DNA evidence was a whole new world in the criminal defence bar at that time, and it'll be very interesting today to explore the progress we've made. Our next speaker, Dr. Ian Freckleton, is well equipped to do that, and he's going to be talking about the nature of decisions that lawyers make as binary decisions as against the nature of scientific evidence and the way scientists might present it, and also a topic of expert anxiety, which is, I think, lawyers facing the breadth of knowledge and worrying that they won't understand it, and that, more importantly, that the judge or jury won't understand it, and for that reason opposing it. Again, if you'll forgive me for drawing from my own experience, I had a case a civil case in New South Wales where an elderly male barrister wanted to call an expert to give evidence of how long it would take a woman ordinarily to clean a house each week. I said, I may not need expert evidence on that, Mr. I think I can probably draw from my own experience. But he seemed to think it was something that the court would need assistance with. Professor Ian Freckleton is a full-time King's Counsel practising in Australia. His practice is trial, appellate and advisory. He's also a Professor of Law and a Professional Fellow in Psychiatry at the University of Melbourne and an Honorary Professor of Forensic Medicine at Monash. Please welcome Professor Freckleton, who's online.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. I'm in Alice Springs at the moment, so a very different world, and I acknowledge the local Indigenous people of the Arrernte Nation and the Warlpiri Nation in Yuendamu. You'll be reading about what I'm doing here this week in the media over the next few days. Let me go to the point made by the Chief Justice about the very essence of legal processes. They are dichotomous, they are binary. It's all about whether admitted evidence enables proof beyond reasonable doubt in criminal matters and proof on the balance of probabilities in civil matters. If the admitted evidence is not sufficient, the party bringing the action, be it the prosecution or the plaintiff, loses the case. Hence, you can see what I mean in terms of it being binary. But when expert scientific evidence is adduced in court, there are multiple anxieties about it. And that's because things have gone badly wrong on a number of high-profile occasions. In a case in Canada, there was articulation of the worry in quite an eloquent way. The case of speaking of apprehension at expert testimony, the judge said, cloaked as it generally is in scientific language, will acquire a mystical air of infallibility, but technical vocabularies often communicate to those versed in the expert's discipline. The fear then is that rather than assisting, the expert will usurp the processes of the decision-making process. Part of that is about the biases that Professor Chubb has just referred to. The worry that what actually comes out as the expression of an expert opinion is in fact the product of undue affiliation for one reason or another with a party. The reasons may well not be sinister, but the relationship between the party and the expert may have an impact upon not just what is said, but how it is communicated. So the threshold issue in many respects is how scientific evidence gets through the closed door, whether it is welcomed or whether it is rejected. And the process for determining that is by reference to what the law calls its exclusionary rules of evidentiary admissibility. In short, they delineate what status admitted evidence or what evidence is to have, whether it's to be admitted or declined. If it's admitted, then the court can work out what weight to give to the evidence. Now, the status of evidence changes as time passes, of course, and a testing ground for controversies about evidentiary admissibility in the scientific area have varied as the years have passed. One of the most significant cases was as long ago as 1912, when dactyloscopy evidence was sought to be put before the Supreme Court of Victoria. More recent times, of course, we've had one controversy after another to do with DNA testing evidence. We've had worries about how to use evidence of possibility en route to that potentially amounting to evidence of probability. Polygraph evidence has figured in many different ways in our cases. Lip reading evidence, facial and body mapping evidence have been controversial. Latterly, forensic gait analysis evidence, shoe print analysis, and just recently last year in the High Court, there was reason to rule on the status of evidence about wounds that may have been self-inflicted or perhaps they were not. So that's been the area in which arguments have taken place about what evidence ought to be allowed in through those doors to which I have made reference. Now, one of the issues that arises is whether we create a special rules for what's sometimes called novel scientific evidence, namely evidence that is fresh. It's in the processes of development. It hasn't yet become generally accepted. And in a case in Western Australia building on a sequence of decisions about the issue, the Court of Appeal spoke about the party offering the novel scientific evidence bearing the burden of demonstrating that it has been accepted as reliable among impartial and disinterested experts within the scientific community. I want you to bear in mind some of those words if you would, because I'll return to them in other guises. So the process of evaluating whether evidence ought to be allowed in through the door requires application of a whole range of rules of expert evidence that seek to distinguish what can safely be received from what cannot. The key one for our purposes is the opinion evidence rules, but there are others beside. And of course, expert evidence isn't always just in the form of opinion. We tend to think of that, but it could also be in relation to fact. Sometimes it can also be in the form of conjecture, which is highly problematic. At least so the High Court has told us. Last year, in the case to which I made reference relating to self-inflicted wounds, the High Court held that, of course, expert evidence need not be opinion evidence. Sometimes the evidence is nothing more than imparting expert knowledge, giving a technical description of events and processes in which the expert was personally involved, doing the experiment, making observations, and similar. By contrast, an opinion is an inference drawn from observed and communicable data. And the High Court said that, or observed that the tribunal of fact, that might be a jury, it might be a judge or a magistrate, might at most be assisted in the performance of the function by being apprised of the opinion of someone else, an expert, based on their specialised knowledge or experience. The probative value of evidence of an opinion, based on that specialised knowledge or experience, lies in the extent, if any, to which the opinion has the potential to help the trier of fact in drawing inferences from those facts. So let's go back to one of those categories of evidence to which I drew attention earlier, polygraph evidence. Polygraph evidence for 101 years has been troubling for our courts, and one of the most influential cases internationally about expert evidence related to a primitive precursor of the modern polygraph, the sphygmomanometer. And this is what the court decided in terms of trying to find a way of delineating between what could be used and what should not be. And 101 years ago, the court observed, when a principle crosses the line between the experimental and the demonstrable stages is difficult to define, something I'm sure with which we could concur now. Somewhere in this twilight zone, the evidential force of the principle must be recognised, and while the courts will go a long way in admitting expert evidence deduced from a well-recognised scientific principle or discovery, the thing from which the deduction is made must be sufficiently established to have gained general acceptance in the field to which it belongs. So you can see the approach of the United States Court was one of general deference to the scientific community. If most within the community considered that the principle was generally accepted, then the law should receive it too. In the case of a particular issue to do with the sphygmomanometer, the court concluded that it hadn't yet reached the relevant status. It hadn't gained such standing and scientific recognition amongst physiological and psychological authorities as would justify its reception. Now, the issue went to the United States Supreme Court in 1992 in a case that became very well known about whether a morning sickness drug was teratogenic, birth defect causing. And the United States Supreme Court, for all federal jurisdictions, replaced the Frye test with one focusing upon reliability, and it identified 4 indicia of reliability. In short, falsifiability, the extent to which the theory or technique had been the subject of peer review and publication, the known or potential rate of error and existence and maintenance of standards, and then the last one is recognisable from the Frye test, whether it had gained general acceptance within the relevant scientific community. Much controversy immediately emerged about whether this was a tougher test or a weaker one. Ultimately, the United Kingdom has followed a similar trajectory, and in the current practice directions for criminal trials, as you can see, expert opinion evidence is regarded as admissible if it's relevant, it's needed to assist the court, witnesses up to the job of giving it, and note the words, the expert opinion is sufficiently reliable to be admitted. And it explains factors that the court might take into account in determining the reliability of expert opinion. I won't go through them all, but they include validity of methodology, whether the opinion properly explains the safety or lack of it, of the inference, when the opinion takes a proper account of matters such as precision or margin of uncertainty, affecting the accuracy of or reliability of results, whether it's been peer-reviewed, whether there was sufficient information available to the expert to express a considered opinion, and whether the expert has been iconoclastic, whether they've followed orthodox procedures or departed from them. In Australia, we have taken a different road under the Evidence Act, which dates back to recommendations of the Law Reform Commission in the 1980s. And our focus is upon whether a person proffering opinion evidence has specialised knowledge. That knowledge has to be based on their training, study or experience. So what we look at is the opinion, its relationship to specialised knowledge, and the relationship of that knowledge to training, study or experience. It's beguilingly straightforward. The courts possess an obligation and also a discretion still to exclude specialised knowledge evidence if it's made it through that initial hurdle. In criminal matters, a court is obliged to decline the evidence from the prosecution if its probative value is outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice to the defendant. Far from straightforward. In civil matters, the court has a discretion to decline to admit evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the three dangers that you can see on your screen. Sir Owen Dixon, the Chief Justice of the High Court in days gone by, was very keen to avoid the culture of assertion from experts. Believe me, I'm an expert, the ipse dixit. And what we've seen in the last few years is a focus in appellate case law upon requirements for expert opinions to be identified, given to the court through admitted evidence, for assumptions to be articulated, and experts' reasoning to be exposed so that it can be evaluated in an accessible way and so that evidence from one expert can be compared with that from another. You're going to hear soon from Kirsten Edwards, who will talk to you a little bit about the decision of Honeysett and the Queen, which related to forensic identification based upon evidence from a forensic anatomist. I won't say more about the case, I'll leave that to Kirsten, but one of the interesting aspects of the case was that it considered what constitutes both knowledge and specialised knowledge. The Australian High Court drew upon the language from the United States Supreme Court in Daubert and postulated that knowledge is acquaintance for these purposes with facts, truths, or principles. It referred to Daubert, which said that the word knowledge connotes more than subjective belief or unsupported speculation. It applies to any body of known facts or any body of ideas inferred from such facts or accepted as truths on good grounds. I suspect the scientists in the audience will find that definition interesting and stimulating. It's far from straightforward, but that's only part of the equation, of course. There's also the requirement that knowledge be specialised. That's a little easier. It's clearly enough knowledge outside that held by the moiety, beyond people who have not by training, study or experience acquired an understanding, maybe of matters that are not of a scientific or technical kind. It may be from Aboriginal trackers, but it does have to be specialised. Importantly, arguments have been advanced in Australia to endeavour to pick up on the United States case law in Daubert about reliability as an admissibility criterion, or at least to be relevant to those opportunities under Section 137, where a court is obliged to decline certain evidence, and then in civil matters where it can, in its discretion, decline to receive evidence. The argument has been put that reliability should be a standalone criterion. In two key decisions, the High Court has repudiated those arguments authoritatively, and it has said that the question is one of specialised knowledge and that other concepts such as reliability cannot be intruded into the process of determining whether evidence should be admitted. So let me conclude. We have then in the law of Australia a focus upon specialised knowledge within the meaning that has been attributed to each of those words in combination. There is no separate category of novel scientific evidence which has its own rules or a special status. The focus of our decisions from appellate courts has been on the requirement that opinions from experts be both transparent and accountable, enabling courts to evaluate their probative value by reason of the bases and assumptions being exposed. Sometimes evidence of possibility is received, and the difficult question arises, how many possibilities make a probability? But that's an epistemological debate that I'm not qualified to enter. What we can say with more confidence is that by contrast with the position in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, India, and probably New Zealand, we have become an outlier. Reliability is not a formal yardstick for admissibility or exclusion. It seems to me, if I may offer a concluding observation that leaves a problematic level of unguided latitude for the threshold decisions that have to be made by judges in deciding the admissibility issue. Next, it leaves the tantalizing issue of how one evaluates probative value of evidence of questionable reliability that has been received. What I've hoped to do in these short remarks is to introduce you to the jurisprudence on expert opinion evidence in this country by contrast with others, and to raise the threshold issue of the utility of reliability, a concept that for the moment we have rejected, but which perhaps should reappear to provide some assistance to our courts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Our next speaker is going to speak about a different challenge that we face in bringing evidence to court, which is the way in which it's expressed or explained to the jury. Kirsten Edwards is a senior counsel practising in criminal law and inquests and inquiries in New South Wales. She has a particular interest in corporate crime and the law of evidence. Ms Edwards is an adjunct associate professor at the School of Law at UNSW, where she co-teaches a course involving advocacy, evidence and ethics, and she has also lectured in evidence law at the University of Sydney Law School and the University of Technology Law School. When Kirsten asked me what she should speak about, I suggested she might address some of the cases she's lost. And she's going to speak about one in particular, a matter that went to the High Court in Itagrul, involving the way in which evidence about mitochondrial DNA was explained to the jury. And if I could summarise the issue in that case, I would say that Kirsten probably understands better than others why I would prefer to buy a French cheese that was 10% fat-free than 90% fat, because of the different way that that expression might make me feel about the cheese I was consuming.
Hello. I'll be following on from Ian with some practical examples, talking about two High Court cases that have explored how scientific information can and should be put before the courts. In particular, juries. I'm sorry, I will just be focusing on criminal cases involving juries, but it does apply in its reasoning to civil cases as well. The first case is a very sad case called Itagrul, where a woman was savagely murdered by stabbing, and her former boyfriend of some years ago was convicted of her murder. It wasn't a particularly strong Crown case. My bias has already been revealed in that I was the losing junior counsel, but there wasn't a whole lot of evidence. The strongest and most critical piece of evidence was mitochondrial DNA, which had been extracted from a small hair that had been found under the victim's fingernail. As some of you here may know, mitochondrial DNA is drawn from the mitochondria of a cell, and the profile is shared down the matrilineal line. So that means a mother will share a mitochondrial DNA profile with her mother, her grandmother, her sisters and her daughters. A man will share a mitochondrial DNA likewise with his mother, grandmother, maternal aunties and so on. What that means from a practical point of view is that it's not that rare, which means that the statistical chances of a random person in the community sharing the same DNA profile are entirely different than you might see in other DNA cases where you might have heard of 1 in 100 billion being thrown about. The chances here could be described in two different ways. One is the frequency ratio. So that is the chance of a randomly selected person in the community sharing the same profile. That was 1 in 16,000 for the general community, and it went right down to about 1 in 100 for the Turkish community. Everyone involved in the case was Turkish. But it was also expressed as an exclusion percentage, and that is the proportion of the community who don't have the same mitochondrial DNA profile. And that was expressed as 99.9%. So the case threw up two issues, which I think are very interesting. The first is, can it be unfairly prejudicial to have evidence described in a particular way, in this case the exclusion percentage, because people find it vastly more persuasive than a mathematically identical formulation, in this case the frequency ratio. This is the 99.9% fat-free formulation. But secondly, accepting that there is such a psychological phenomenon that means that people treat identical concepts in an entirely different way, how is it that the court's supposed to know about this? How is the court supposed to find out about it? And the issue arose in a really interesting way in Idagul because, and this doesn't happen very often, a senior judge off his own bat went off and did some research by himself after the appeal was over, or perhaps assisted by his associates, he did some research. And so what he found was that there was a whole body of psychological literature on the impact of presenting statistical information in a particular way. And he found that it was very well established within this behavioural science community that people aren't computers. They don't treat identical mathematical concepts the same. So if people are given a field of reference, like 1 in 10, they can imagine how many other people share that profile because they can imagine the proverbial football field and how many people in the football field might have the same profile. Something like 99.9% can convey something that's almost certain, and that's because people do shortcuts, rounding up, heuristic devices. So the judge in the appeal case, albeit he was out on his own, he was in dissent in that case, held 99.9% invited a risk of subconscious rounding up. And he said this should not be allowed to be used in the courtroom. The other two agreed that the two percentages had a different impact on juries, but they said no, the evidence can go in. We appealed to the High Court, partly on the strength of this dissenting opinion, and we lost on both points. So just doing a little illustration there of probative value and unfair prejudice that you heard from me and that the court has to assess. The argument that we ran on at the appeal is that the court already had a reliable piece of evidence before it. It had the frequency ratio, which everyone agrees is accurate and everyone agrees is not unfairly prejudicial. So we said, what's the exclusion percentage actually adding? You're not putting anything into this bucket of probative value because we've already got the probative value, but you're adding a lot of prejudice to this bucket. And accordingly, we say that the unfair prejudice substantially outweighed the probative value. That argument went down like the proverbial lead balloon in the High Court. What the High Court said was, we don't accept any premise of the argument that you're making. They said, the probative value of the evidence is the same, and you don't get to carve it up based on how it's expressed. Essentially, it's the same piece of evidence. They even sort of wondered whether one piece of expression could have two different rules. They said, given that they're mathematically the same, the probative value is inherently necessarily the same. When it came to unfair prejudice, they said, it doesn't matter. The jury are getting both formulations, and in fact, one judge said, maybe some people in the jury who get maths more than the others could explain it to the others. And if counsel want to make submissions, they can. So if the defence counsel wants to say, well, that's still 16 people in the proverbial football field, they can still do that. So the jury gets all the information before them and people can explain it. But the bottom line was, there's nothing unfairly prejudicial about evidence that's persuasively powerful and high impact, provided it's scientifically accurate and correct. Now, the second issue in the case is probably less controversial. The court said it's just not acceptable, or it wouldn't have been acceptable for the judge to be decided based, for the decision to be based on the judge's private research, particularly because it hadn't been part of the argument at trial or on appeal. And I've put a quote up there from the judgment, but the import of that quote is, we'll accept that the psychological impact of this particular expression makes a difference to people. We'll accept that that's pretty well established, but it's not so obviously well accepted that it can be taken as a fact or something that just goes without saying, and that's called judicial notice. And that's what Her Honour was taking into account about how long it takes to clean a house, no doubt based on years of experience. So,
that was personal experience.
So what they said was, if you want to rely on these sorts of concepts, that's fine, you can, but you need to call a witness, have them examined and cross-examined, and so on. Now, that's hard to argue with, I'll accept, but courts are a bit inconsistent because actually a large number of behavioural scientific concepts are just accepted as facts that go without saying. So take a really gory graphic photograph of an injury, which is still an anatomically correct depiction of something which is an issue in the case. Courts will accept that if it's really gory and distressing, it goes out because it might overwhelm the jury's rationality. Similarly, I don't know if you've seen in American TV when the witness gets asked, do you see the man that robbed you in the courtroom? And the witness, that man there. It goes without saying in Australian courts, without any witness ever having to go before a court and say so, that that's just hopelessly prejudicial. Obviously, the jury is going to be impressed by that and it's going to be unfair, so that goes out. So what's treated as a truth in law and what has to be proved by evidence is a very clear-cut distinction, as Ian has been explaining to you, but there's actually underlying it not a whole lot of rigour and analysis about what's crept in historically as a matter of fact, and what is more novel and needs to be proved. So the next case I'm going to go to is about CCTV evidence, and it's called Honeysett. Honeysett was about an armed robbery in a pub. It had 3 offenders, and again, it wasn't a particularly strong Crown case except for some CCTV evidence of the offenders, but the offenders were disguised, so they were hard to see. As Ian's explained, the Crown called an expert witness, an expert anatomist, to give evidence about how facial features of the appellant were similar to the offender in the footage. So what he did was he looked at pictures that he had of the accused, both in his jail cell and just some still images. Then he looked at the pictures of the robbery in the pub, and he told the jury that there was a high degree of anatomical similarity between the offender and the accused, and no anatomical dissimilarity. And I've just put up here an extract from his evidence. I'm not going to read it out, but you'll see some sort of scientific terms being used there: ectomorphic, lumbar lordosis. I don't know how to pronounce the long head and the small head. Brachycephalic. And the High Court rejected the admissibility of this evidence, and it wasn't allowed to take place. It wasn't allowed admitted into the courtroom. Now, this decision, Honeysett, had been a long time coming. There'd been a lot of disputes in lower courts about whether this type of facial mapping evidence should be allowed, and it had worked its way through the courts below. Facial mapping, or body morphology evidence, as it was known, is a combination of photo anthropometry, morphological analysis, and photographic superimposition. Now, I'm holding back the best bit, which is just, if you have a look at that evidence just one more time, I'm now going to show you the actual footage that was involved. So that's what they had. So you can see the stakes here. You can see the value to a prosecutor with footage like that in getting an expert to come along and say that there was a high degree of similarity between the offender and this man or woman here. You can also see the anxiety of defence lawyers about how it could possibly be that this person could turn up and say that there are clear facial similarities, clear similarities in build. He's right-handed, he has dark skin. You won't be surprised to know the alleged offender was Aboriginal. So in the cases that had worked their way through the lower courts, all sorts of reliability issues had been traversed. There's issues of image distortion, lighting distortions, camera angles, clothing, poor quality footages, and also just confirmation bias, the fact that you're looking at one person, you're looking at another, you start to see what you want to see. Not to mention the prejudice of someone being arrested and put on trial and the other evidence there might be against them. There's also very little literature or support in this field on falsifiability, error rates, peer review, protocols underlying statistical assumptions. But as Ian's told you, in Australia, reliability issues won't of themselves make evidence inadmissible. It's also highly subjective. It doesn't involve statistical analysis. Despite the term body mapping, it doesn't involve any mapping or measurements. Really, it's just looking at a person and making a call. But then there's lots of science that goes into the courtroom that is subjective. Fingerprinting comparisons, handwriting analysis, tyre comparison, bullet comparison. What this case was supposed to be the watershed for was this argument that independent means of validation should be the criteria for expert evidence, and without an independent means of falsifiability or validation, it shouldn't get in. But the court wouldn't go there. What they did do, though, was erect some scaffolding around what it meant to have a specialised field of expertise and what it meant for evidence to be substantially drawn from that expertise. And I'll pass over this slide because we went through it with Ian. But the distinction between having expertise and your opinion being drawn from the expertise was what really cut through in this case, because the court said, we're happy to accept that he actually knows what he's talking about. He knows about anatomy. But just because you've written a book on oval-shaped heads and you know how many people have oval-shaped heads and you can describe what an oval-shaped head is, doesn't mean that you're doing much when you say, well, that guy has an oval-shaped head and I reckon that guy does in that blurry footage. And the professor had conceded in his evidence that all he was doing was just basically what anyone else would do. He just happened to have a really good understanding of the human body and how it worked and the proportions of the human body. So the court wasn't going to have a bar of giving this scientific overlay when in reality it was just a subjective say-so of somebody that wasn't drawn from his accepted expertise. And you can see the High Court being a bit salty there about him using the term ectomorphic when that's really just a fancy term for the word skinny. So they also quoted, and this is a quote from a prosecutor in the jury in Honeysett. They quoted, and I'll just read this out. The jury were told by the prosecutor, I'd suggest that you would accept his evidence of being assistance to you because it's reliable science and it's something that he can explain, even though you may not be able to see all the things that he's been able to see. I'll just go back to, there we go. So in conclusion, the High Court didn't accept that reliability or validation was a precondition for admissibility, but you can really see some discomfort creeping in through the lines about someone saying, well, he's a scientist, so just accept what he has to say. But in my opinion, that discomfort was really the cumulative effect of everything that had gone before. That is, the novelty of the science, the fact that they were aware of all these disputes about reliability that had gone through the lower courts. And ultimately, it was just a bridge too far for the court to accept. So to use a behavioural science term, a tipping point was reached with this evidence. It was almost a weekly proposition that a body mapper would give evidence in New South Wales trials because CCTV is so common. It's now almost never seen at all. So this particular case has completely changed this one part of the evidentiary landscape. I was going to go on to talk about where it goes next, but I think I'm out of time. So,
Well, we can go a little bit further.
a little bit further? Okay.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, 2 minutes. I can do that, Chief Justice. Okay, so what the court did say, though, in this case was, and this has continued, there's nothing to stop people playing that CCTV footage and the jury watching it and then making their own assessment if it looks like the person in the dock. Now, you might think that might carry its own sort of suggestibility and bias when you're thinking there's a man, he's sitting there in handcuffs surrounded by armed guards, and you're looking at the picture, and then you're looking at the guy, and then you're looking at the picture, and then you're looking at the guy. And defence counsel and prosecutors can make submissions about what they say might be similar or dissimilar. Now, I'm reserved in an appeal in the South Australian Court of Appeal where the principal evidence was CCTV footage of a very horrible murder connected to some Hells Angels versus Sphinx rivalry in South Australia. This is my client here, and this is probably the clearest CCTV still that was drawn of the video. When I say this is my client here, to be clear, we violently disagree that this is my client here, but this is the man alleged to be my client here. Now, what the prosecutor did in his closing address was he had all these pictures of my actual client, and then he was just going back and forth between the pictures and then this, and then he'd go and he'd say, look at this guy, and then look at this, and he'd say, clearly, they're the same. I mean, they're obviously the same. They have the same facial features. Look at this, he's got a very distinctive nose, he's got a very distinctive mouth. This guy has a very distinctive nose, he has a very distinctive mouth. He said he has an unusual long nose, a protruding lip, a habit of keeping his mouth open. He has long muscular arms, interestingly, long muscular legs, and a distinctive forward posture when walking, which you can see he's actually carrying a rifle there. In this appeal, we argue essentially the prosecutor has just walked into the lacuna that's been left by these experts not being allowed to give evidence. He is now the guy saying, just trust me, I see things even though you may not be able to see them. And we said that carries with it all sorts of danger about prejudice and suggestibility, and the judge really needed to warn the jury that they had to make their own assessment, and there was a great deal of danger in the prosecutor engaging in this analysis. But what the court raised with us back, and as I said, it hasn't been decided, is prosecutors aren't exactly scientists though, are they? Scientists have the white coat, they have the patina of independence, of authority, of years of studying. Everyone knows that the prosecutor is a player, they're an advocate for one side, and the defence counsel can also make their arguments against as well. So the argument that the prosecutor had just assumed the cloak of a scientist in disguise may not succeed in this case, but I think in the future that's where these issues are going to go. And then the final issue to consider, just joining these two cases together, that is Article and Honeysett, is we're now in a world where people can create deep fakes from CCTV footage, and they can do all sorts of video recreations. I think that these cases are going to be revisited when both sides, prosecutors and defence, think, well, why don't I just create a video of what might have happened and play that to the jury, and that whole issue of how they're going to receive that information and who can speak to it will come up again, but that's yet to come. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. Very thought-provoking presentation. And if I could at least put your minds at rest in one respect, our last two speakers, if they are anything, they are exquisitely well qualified to speak about their topic of expertise, and there can be no doubt that what they're going to speak about is very much based on their expertise. Professor Mette Nyegaard is the head of research group in genomic medicine at Aalborg University in Denmark and head of the Department of Congenital Disorders at Statens Serum Institute, which is the department responsible for congenital disorder screening of all newborns in Denmark. And Professor Michael Toft-Overgaard is the Professor of Protein Science in the Department of Chemistry and Bioscience at the same university. And as you've heard, they're going to speak about the extraordinary experience of their participation in the ultimate acquittal of Folbig. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are both very, very honored to be here. So we are actually married. I don't know if that's clear. So yes. So Michael is a professor in protein science, and I'm a professor in genetics and personalized medicine. So what is really the difference between us? So I work with DNA and with genes, and as you may recall, genes are segments of DNA that is instructions. They are instructions for making proteins. So my focus is asking what mutations are causing disease. You could say, what does the mutation do with human health? And we often work with large populations, so much of this is based on statistics. So here's what Michael does. So he works then with the proteins, and his focus is, what does the mutation do to the actual protein? So I work with, what does the mutation do to the human health? And Michael is asking or trying to understand, what does mutations at the protein level do to the actual protein using functional assays.
Okay, so I'll try to take over. So I'm Michael, married to Mette. And I'll try to give you somewhat quickly an overview of how we got involved in the Folbig case. Of course, this is in the end a stretch of 20 years. In the hearing procedures, we spent likely 7 hours explaining what we knew, so we'll do it a little bit shorter today. So let me just see if I can use the mouse here. Yes. So just to go back, and it's been mentioned before that Kathleen Folbig was sentenced to 40 years in prison in 2003. There were a number of different appeals and proceedings, which basically we did not know anything about. Our story sort of begins in 2012, when Mette led a team of scientists, was the one who discovered the very first mutation in a gene called calmodulin. And that this mutation caused sudden cardiac death in young people. We had this published in 2012, and the next that happened was in 2019, at least from our perspective, when in the end of the first inquiry, which was based on identification of another mutation in the calmodulin gene, a new mutation by the team led by Carola Vinuesa here from Canberra, was presented as part of this inquiry. But her evidence that this might be a potential pathogenic mutation was really not heard by the inquiry. So she reached out, sent an email to me and asked, could you help characterize this new mutation? And I said, yes, we can do that. So we characterized the effect of the mutation, and in 2021, it took a little bit longer than expected because we also had something called COVID in between, so our laboratories were closed partially. But in 2021, we published the effect of this mutation in a combined analysis with the genetic analysis, and I think in total 27 international researchers. So this was the paper called the so-called Brohus paper, this publication. At that point, I think we were sort of sure that we were done with this case, but and nothing really happened until a year later, where based on the work of the Academy and this the scientific evidence that we published was the cause for a new inquiry, so the second inquiry into the case. And we were asked by the defense team to make a report to explain in a more layman term, what does this evidence that you produced, what does it mean? So we ended up making a couple of reports for the inquiry. We were called in to give oral evidence. We then, during this procedure, before giving the oral evidence, actually in the week before, made some new data. And those new data were also taken into account, and they led to a change in procedure that we were then giving evidence in chief. And the inquiry was paused for 3 months for the other parties to take this evidence into consideration. So we returned 3 months later to continue our oral proceeding of giving evidence, also having to make another report to try and answer to some of the other experts. And later in 2023, the conclusion was that there was a reasonable doubt. Kathleen Folbig was pardoned and released, and later the sentence was quashed. So, very brief overview of our introduction, and as you see down here, there were actually on 3 different occasions where we made data that had a significant impact on this case. So, if you go back, Mette has alluded a little bit to this. Our role in the Folbig case was going from genes, genetic information. The DNA sequence was
present at the 2019 inquiry. There was a mutation in the CALM2, so that's the gene encoding calmodulin. But at that time point, it's predicted to be pathogenic. And there was actually discrepancy in opinion about whether it was pathogenic or not. So what we did was produce the protein in the laboratory and demonstrate that it had a damaging effect on the protein function. And we compared the damaging effect to other mutations that were known to be pathogenic, and it was similar in size. In addition, we involved collaborators, so we're actually 3 independent laboratories performing different types of tests, so at different levels, demonstrating that this mutation was damaging on the function of the calmodulin protein. You could ask, why did Carola reach out to us or email me? Well, the reason is that my laboratory actually specializes, and has done so since like 15 years now, in looking at the effects of exactly changes to the calmodulin protein. What do they do to the function of this particular protein? And we have now more than 20 scientific publications dealing with this topic. Now you can ask, why am I so interested in calmodulin? Well, that's because Mette found the very first mutations in this gene and asked me, could you look, please, at the effect on the protein, and how do you say no to that? So that's why we got involved.
Yes, so that's what husbands are for. Yes, so we have had many experiences during this. So here we would like to mention 4 which we think is relevant for today. So the first one is really to make your science count. It needs to be understood. So this was our first time as expert witness. We'd never tried it before, not in Denmark either. So we were talking a lot about how we're going to communicate and who are we going to talk to. So we decided that our report should be kind of scholarly. We would really like to explain. And we would try in that to avoid using these technical terms. And when you've been in a field for many years, you can almost not hear it yourself. And we talk also like that. So what we basically did was ask our daughter. So this is our daughter. Can you read through this? And she's now an expert in reading science document from us, because she exactly, this is not understandable, and this is not understandable. And this was very, very helpful. Something we also did with our report was try the complicated concepts. Could we make some kind of analogies? Analogies, is that what it's? Yes. So for example, for this particular, what Michael explained, that in 2019, the calmodulin mutation was identified at the DNA level and was predicted to be dangerous or pathogenic. And then what was done in 2021 was actually to produce the protein. So we made this bread analogy, which is almost like you have a spelling mistake in a recipe for bread. And if you know something about baking bread, you can almost predict this is going really wrong. But what was done in 2021 was like baking the bread, so you could actually see it. So this is what we tried to do for these technical terms. So I would say that our first experience is that if scientists, they really need to make an effort if they want their data to be fully taken into consideration. So this is what was our first experience.
Yes. And we had many experiences, but we'll stay with 4. So second experience was actually, you can say, something that is well known, but to us was an epiphany that the other experts, in particular some of the clinicians or cardiologists, they were still skeptical about the effects of this mutation. And so that's one part. And then we found by reading the reports that they have made that they had no problem whatsoever in making finite conclusion that this is not dangerous. Based on my experience, based on what we know, I cannot see this is dangerous mutation or pathogenic mutation, and they use a special scoring system for saying whether or not it reaches the level of pathogenicity. So perfectly understand that in a world of clinicians, you need to make a finite diagnosis and tell your patients and base a treatment on that. So you a little bit similar to the courtroom. You need to end up with a finite decision. This is what we do. Now, scientists, on the other hand, of course, we rarely say with certainty this is how it is. So we're always exploring that, and until now, with the knowledge we have, given this hypothesis, we try to test it, and we cannot prove it, but we cannot disprove it. So it's most likely that this is how it is. So we make our statements in a less rigorous and finite manner. We then work over time and establish new knowledge. So we are intrigued by new knowledge. Also, we use model systems, which means that you have to believe those model systems actually reflects the real world, which is different from the clinicians. They are sitting with the patient, the real world, right in front of them. Now, we recall that the Fulbeck case was a new mutation, never seen before in the world. So therefore, we argued that, and discussed this actually with counsel assisting before giving oral evidence. We understand this difference between disciplines, but perhaps even though we come out with a not so firm conclusion, perhaps it's worth listening to the scientists because we are used to working with new evidence. Okay, so as a general advice to the legal system, just acknowledge that the different types of experts will put different weight. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is the actual weight that it has in the courtroom.
Yes, so I'm going to talk about our third experience. So this is about words, and words, they can mean very different things in different fields. So in nature, and when we talk genetics, pathogenic, or you could say harmful mutations, they are rare. And this is because we have this force in nature's natural selection. They remove the dangerous mutations from the population through this process we call purifying selection. It really means that individuals carrying these mutations, they are less likely to survive or have children. So in that way, really, really bad mutations, they become really, really rare. So in genetics, you could say rare is relevant in this case. So it was really an eye-opener during the hearing that in legal practice, rare is irrelevant. And so when geneticists, they say that something is rare, we really mean it aligns very well with the fact that it's dangerous. So, and this is the complete opposite to irrelevant. So one we really spent a lot of time on was making this key genetic concept very clear, that rare is relevant. So be aware that words can have very different meanings in different fields.
Yes. So finally, I'll say another experience we got was when getting the other critical expert reports, reading through, we were surprised that, first of all, that they could not see that this looked like a dangerous mutation, even following publication of the effect. And it revealed this gap in understanding, that they relied on well-known previous knowledge, and given this is a new mutation, it's hard to reach this level of pathogenicity in their terms. But we were curious to why they didn't really understand. So looking very carefully at the reports, they actually came up in their objection with something that inspired us to see exactly why they did not understand and what the differences was between their understanding and our understanding. And it inspired us so much that we could make new experiments in the week before the actual hearing and demonstrate that the specific mutation in the Folbic family had some abilities that other mutations didn't have. That might actually bridge the gap in understanding. And when we presented this to the council assisting, they decided to actually change the procedure and having us giving evidence in chief and then postponing the rest of the inquiry. So they took this very new evidence, which has not been, you can say, collaborated by or shown by any other laboratories, but now has been published in in a peer-reviewed paper. They took it in as part of the inquiry. So in this case, the legal system allowed a sort of a peer-reviewed system. We were allowed to look at the other reports and actually, in a productive manner, answer that with new data and new knowledge. Okay, finally, I'll say a little bit about our overall experience. To us, this was a good experience with the legal system. We were ensured a non-adversary space, so we were not forced to give yes or no answers. There was room and time to explain. We were allowed to show pictures, like you can see here. So this is from the actual tribe. And the inquiry understood that this was a new matter, so not some well-known established knowledge. For us, it was also a challenge. It was a completely new setting, just like this one. So very first time for us. We had no training in how to do this. And we were told just before the event that it would be live streamed on YouTube. That was also a little bit of a challenge. So we have maybe one advice in the end that we can give and potentially for the Academy of Science here. It would have been nice to have an established support as a scientist. So how do you do this? So how do you make sure that you are heard? What are the pitfalls and what should we think about when giving written or oral evidence? And this could be a form of guideline or counseling of some sort. So I think.
So maybe I can just, and kind of a neutral place to go to have. So not one or the other corner, but a neutral kind of advice and guidance from a neutral entity. Yes. Yes, that's what it is.
Thank you. What an absolute treat hearing that account. We do have some time for questions. I'm going to start off with one question for our guests from Denmark. At what point during the Folbig saga did you realise that you were in love with each other? But no, my serious question is, what was the response after the pause and the peer review? Were you then? Was there a challenge to the evidence, or was it effectively accepted at that point?
So I can talk for hours about that, of course. We were
2 minutes.
2 minutes. We were extremely surprised that the other expert, including 2 new cardiologists that were called in, simply just discharged our new evidence. So they said this is scientific evidence. It's made in a model system. We have no idea whether it translates into a human. And so mostly it was completely ignored.
So that was you're talking about a model system for the baking of the bread was based on a model system?
Yes, so the new data we made was of course also
in
a model system where we showed a specific effect of the Folbic mutation, that it affected another gene that they were thinking could be more responsible for the phenotype they saw.
And the other comment I would make about that presentation is what an extraordinary opportunity it was, as you said, for expert evidence given in proceedings to be peer reviewed, because the closest we come to that is by having a process of evidence being given concurrently by experts. I personally favour that process. I think it's very valuable. I think if you get two experts sitting next to each other, looking at each other, they're less likely to be dismissive or cantankerous. They're more likely to be professionally respectful and find common ground. But you don't usually get it happening with that opportunity for full review. So we have time for questions. Does anybody want to ask a question of any of our distinguished guests, including, remember, we've got Ian Freckleton online? And while you're all overcoming your... Yes? Sorry, we've got a microphone. Just wait for the microphone, just so that people who are... everyone in the room can hear.
Thank you. I guess my question is directed to our barristers, but I mean, if the scientists want to add, feel free. But do you see, I guess, the science model of constantly accreting knowledge and adding onto it and going, oh, well, we can change things. What we thought was good science, maybe not so good science now. When you're talking about things that are admissible and you look back at, whether it's polygraph testing or DNA evidence or fingerprinting, is there a way for the legal system to purge itself of what it no longer thinks should be admissible if it previously let it in?
Well, in that regard, law is a bit like science in that it does revisit things as necessary, and a new case has new evidence from different people at a different stage in the evolution of any given science. So it's not that a decision about a particular theory or principle or technique stands forever. It can be revisited at any stage, which does allow it to be flexible and take account of the evolution of knowledge.
But if your question is directed to individuals who were convicted based on evidence that is later recognised to be junk science or unreliable, the Folbig case is a good example of someone who was exonerated, but it doesn't always happen. There is a process after conviction of inquiry in every jurisdiction in Australia, but most jurisdictions impose a filter for that, where a court has to decide that there should be an inquiry, and that in turn leads to judges considering whether the evidence is new or important. I was mildly horrified, and I don't know why, because I should have known it before, but hearing Kirsten Edwards speaking about the fact that although one of the judges of appeal had done research to show that the way a scientific conclusion is expressed, that me buying cheese that's 10% fat-free, although research showed that did have an impact, that you then had lawyers saying, no, we can't take that into account. And the way that Kirsten put it, she's a very powerful advocate, I sort of thought, actually, that's really troubling. And that's a perfect example of the importance of lawyers being well-informed about the sciences. So sure, you might have people who've been convicted on the strength of body mapping or fingerprint or whatever other later discredited fields of or in-court identification who never had their vindication, if that was your question. So.
And I assume that has to be agitated by the person and their lawyers themselves. There's not like a routine check to see.
No, although in the States there are a lot of like justice projects that go back to people on death row, go back to reconsider the DNA evidence, and I mean there have been terrible horror stories there. People after 46 years in, young men who were young black men, surprise, convicted, and then later exonerated 40 years later, and being heart-wrenchingly humble about the fact that kind young law students helped on the Justice Project and got them out after 40 years in jail. So yeah, it's troubling.
Thank you.
Yes.
My question is reflecting a little bit upon Professor Chubb and also Professor Sagan's reflections that we live in a world that's dependent on science and technology, but not a lot of people know a lot about it. I wonder if anyone on the panel has seen much of a change since the COVID-19 pandemic. 5 years ago, words like immunoassay or Sanger sequencing, half of my friends became armchair epidemiologists. These things weren't really part of our vocabulary. On the other hand, I also know that sometimes the most ignorant people are those people that know half the answers, but they think they know everything. So whether that's actually become putting the trust in science question aside, which has also come around the COVID-19 pandemic, but whether there's actually been an enhancement in people's ability to process questions about science in a legal setting, or general cultural setting, or if actually there's been a bit of a step backwards where people think they know everything now.
Who wants to take that question? No.
That's a wonderful question, but I don't think any of us know the answer.
It's a really good question, isn't it? Because science was propelled into the public domain, and epidemiology became the subject of ordinary conversation in a way that had never happened before. Epidemiologists became celebrity scientists. I think that science achieved a new status for many people, not everybody, in that demonstrably it was there giving us information about a frightening phenomenon and potentially about solutions to it. And then, of course, the vaccine breakthroughs came. So it does seem to me that it's affected the public status and respect for science in fundamental ways. The extent to which people think they know more about what they probably don't is something I couldn't comment on, but I wonder as well.
Could I just add to that?
Yes, please.
Because I agree with that, Ian, but it also gave prominence to the sceptics. So there was a lot more opposition to vaccines given publicity, to repurposing therapies for which there was no evidence whatsoever that they might work, but somebody had a thought, published something somewhere, picked up. And so when people were arguing about the impact of the virus on us all, then what was allowed to flourish was the people who were told, who were telling the story, that what you're being told is not true. And so both flourished at the same time. So whether the net impact on science was plus or minus, I don't know. We'll know when we get the next pandemic, because there will be one. I hope we manage it better. I hope we are better able to get respectable cures and vaccines in early. And I just ask you to remember that we wouldn't have had that vaccine if a decade or so before somebody hadn't sequenced the RNA, and 30 years before that somebody hadn't postulated that we might be able to get a vaccine based on messenger RNA. That woman got sacked several times 40 years ago, won a Nobel Prize more recently because of that work. So there are ups and downs in that story. Where the net impact is, I can't tell you right now. Next vaccine will tell us.
Yes,
next pandemic.
Over there and also over here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. My question's to the whole panel. How do you think that we can translate some of the experiences that the professors had in the Folby inquiry? How do we translate that into a more adversarial justice system where evidence might not be able to listen to for 6 hours on end, and have that same rigorous, worthwhile peer review process where the inquiry is paused for 3 months? How do we translate some of those experiences and those lessons into the more adversarial justice system?
I think, Kirsten, I think you should take the lead on that, and then others can contribute if
I
they
have
want.
much to say on this topic. I think, firstly, the lawyers do have a responsibility to get better educated on these concepts, to ask better questions. In my experience, you can't win, just to use the example of DNA evidence, you can't win a DNA case with a battle of experts and examination and cross-examination. The jury will always favour the prosecution as being more objective, but you can win a case if you effectively cross-examine a prosecution expert with a series of questions that they agree with and building up. And that usually means a lot of preparation, reading the articles and then meeting with them beforehand to talking them through it. Sometimes it means briefing an expert not to give evidence but to assist you in that preparation. I completely agree with the Chief Justice that concurrent evidence is fantastic and is consistently, I think, more reliable than in giving it in adversarial style, and it's being used more and more in adversarial proceedings, including the Court of Criminal Appeals heard concurrent evidence from joint experts, and that was something, there was a great deal of resistance from both sides when that got introduced because people were really worried they couldn't control it. But the quality of the evidence that's come out of that process is so high quality. I don't know anyone now who's against it because they have actually seen it's just better for everybody that these reliable concepts come out and it doesn't become a contest of who asks the best questions, and things from that will emerge. And then I think thirdly, tediously, funding. You can't be, it's all very well for me to say, well, defence lawyers should know more about DNA and they should do the reading and they should work with, if you can't get the funding, as the Chief Justice said, to get a report, you may not have 2 or 3 days to work up this sort of material, and we're living in a chronically underfunded system. Similarly, scientists don't always have time to sit down with you for 3 hours and work through this. I find in my work, particularly in my inquest and inquiry work, people are incredibly generous with their time. They'll sit with me in a hospital cafe or a morgue or wherever it is and spend hours with me. But I have no legitimate right to ask them for that. I'm not paying them, and it's come out of their own integrity and generosity. But more and more, I think there needs to be some recognition for that financially, because people are getting stretched, their departments are shrinking, and it's really hard. So that's my 3.
I'd like to ask Metta and Michael to say, what do you think your experience would be now? And I appreciate you said you hadn't been trained and you wish you had been, but now that you've had that experience, do you think you could convey the message that you conveyed in an adversarial process without that 3-month peer review pause?
I think potentially yes. I think especially if you have the concept where you are discussing with other opponents, that would be a setting that would be agreeable.
I absolutely think concurrent evidence is the way to go.
The risk there is, of course, are we then using a language that is not really understood?
We need Carolyn on the panel, your daughter.
Yeah, maybe we can do that, yeah. to
translate the language. But it does raise that issue of the fact that it takes time to get across the scientific issues for lawyers, but also for other disciplines. So they had 3 months to work out their response to your evidence. I suppose we deal with the exchange of reports to address that, written reports, but there's no doubt, I think, the other thing that concurrent evidence can do is you can order the scientists to meet and then prepare a joint report for the court that isolates the areas of agreement and the areas of disagreement and the reasons, and that's also very effective. There was a lady over here and then over here, but did Ian, did you want to add anything to that last point? All right. No. I think this lady here was next and then over here.
Thank you. My question is somewhat similar. A number of our speakers tonight have mentioned systematic alternatives. Ian Freckleton, you mentioned reliability testing, and we've heard about concurrent evidence giving. So my question to the panel really is your thoughts on ways in which these things can be systematised, routinized, to handle particularly novel scientific evidence better. I know there was an idea being kicked around in the US in the 1970s, which was called science court, which was a bit of a misnomer actually, because it wasn't intended to be adversarial. It was meant to have a sort of format a little bit more like the inquiry that, the second inquiry into the Folbig case. So yeah, thoughts about, systematic institutional mechanisms for handling particularly novel scientific data.
Perhaps one answer to that is a speaker that we had at a previous symposium, and Alan Robertson might remember more, but the lady who spoke from the British Academy of Science or Institute of Science, and they, Ian Freckleton, you're nodding, do you know, they have quite a robust system for producing joint publications, effectively peer reviewing areas that commonly come up in court. Is that consistent with your knowledge?
Yes, it is. It's been very positive in communicating in accessible language, complex areas of scientific endeavour, and that has the effect of elevating the lawyer's understanding so that they can ask better questions in examination in chief and also in cross-examination. So that's certainly a worthwhile educative mechanism, I think. Another aspect of it is that our system is conservative in terms of the information that comes through and into admitted evidence. I would justify that and defend it because we need to be on guard for areas of expert endeavour where experts start talking about ectomorphism when they simply mean people who are skinny, and where their views might be extremely persuasive but may not command the weight that they may appear to. So for our system to lag behind a little and wait to see whether there is not a consensus of views, but a significant body of thinking generated by peer-reviewed consideration, I think has much to commend it. And that means that utilising the approach of England in particular, with a focus on reliability and other indicia of safety in expert reasoning, has a lot to commend it. What we're doing in Australia at the moment is entrusting too much to the discretion of trial judges, and it's a very hard exercise. And at least if there are indicia to measure any given evidence against, that gives a start for a more informed decision-making process about what is a vital threshold question.
See, in America, there's several federal bodies that evaluate evidence across the board, and they review, what you might call junk science, and they put out reports. But then there's this huge disjunct between the scientific community and the legal community. So they've declared most previous areas of forensic science to be junk science, with a few exceptions, including DNA evidence, where there's systems of validation and peer review and things of that nature. But the courts are letting in everything under the sun, and that's the problem. You need to bring both together and have a working scientific community, and then a court that listens to that scientific community.
That you raise. There was a question over here. Thank you.
Given what you've just said, is it time or is it necessary for there to be a review of the Evidence Act to enable it to deal with some of the things we've spoken about tonight? And do we need to consider whether a reliability standard is needed for the admission of evidence, particularly where that evidence is scientific in nature? We've had a discussion around different types of evidence and the weight given to them. Are they timely or necessary, or both?
Yes.
Yes. All right.
Yes, from me too.
Sorry, do you want to add something?
Ian says him too.
Ian agrees. All right. I think we are probably out of time, but if there's one more burning question, I'm prepared to squeeze it in. All right. I'll now ask Alan Robertson on behalf of the Academy of Law to close the session.
Well, I hope you'll all agree with me that we've been treated to a first-rate seminar, stimulating, thought-provoking, and you've had the benefit of hearing from a distinguished panel and its distinguished chair, of course, organising the distinguished panel. I won't go through their different contributions, but I would like to as well thank not only the panellists, also you, the audience, for your questions and discussion. I'd also like to thank the President of the Australian Academy of Science, Jagadish, the Chief Executive, Anna Maria, for her help in organising, and Lisa Crocker and her staff at the Academy of Science. And also I'd like to thank Kylie Cook, the Secretariat of the Australian Academy of Law. I want to end with 2 or 3 very short comments. Meta spoke about language and different understandings of language. I always found that one of the difficulties, and that she was speaking about scientists on the one hand and I think lawyers on the other, I always found that one of the first things you had to do with expert scientists, expert evidence, was to make sure, where there was more than one of them, that they were actually talking the same language. And it was worthwhile spending half an hour before they embarked on writing ornate opinions to make sure that this wasn't going to get down to some verbal quibble and some ships passing in the night where the experts were using different terms for either the same concepts or overlapping concepts. That's the first point I wanted to make. Second point, perhaps a little more frivolous, but it ties in, I think, with what Ian Chubb was talking about as relative knowledge. And Ian Freckleton showed a photograph of former Chief Justice Dixon. And one of his favourite points of exposition was the relative nature of what happened in courtrooms. That is, it was a search for an answer rather than the truth. And one of his favourite anecdotes, short anecdotes, was Pontius Pilate. "What is truth?" said Pontius Pilate, and this was the punchline, and did not stay for an answer. And Dixon's collection of papers, published after he'd retired as Chief Justice, was in fact called Jesting Pilate. And a very good read, because he spoke, this is going back to the 1950s, but he said some seriously wise things to scientists in the United States and elsewhere about the relative fields of endeavour. The last thing, light-hearted, these events, this series of events, they're all called symposia. This is a symposium, and if you remember ancient Greek, symposia, Socrates, I think, was responsible, maybe, they involved drinking. So we now have refreshments. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for the panel.